great pleasure to introduce Paul Faulkner of the University of Sheffield. He's going to talk to us about disagreement and the problem of expert testimony.
Okay, thank you. So I need to start this talk with an apology, which is something that's best to avoid doing, but I'm going to do it anyway. It's just that originally I was going to come to the Trust conference, but for various reasons I couldn't make that. And the Trust conference I would have presented something new. On the expert conference I don't have something new, so what I'm presenting is something that was recently published. That's slightly bad form to present something that's already been published. Not least from my position as a speaker, because I can watch it get undermined. And wish I would have changed it in various ways. Yeah, that's a starting apology. Okay, so I'm going to start with a distinction between believing a speaker versus merely believing what is said. And I'm going to start with the assumption that this is an everyday distinction, and it's an everyday distinction that tracks an epistemic difference. Now, this is something that's widely but not universally accepted amongst epistemologists. In fact, it's very widely accepted, but very far from universally accepted. Indeed, it's a point of some contention. So Jennifer would reject this distinction, for example, but so lots of people would endorse it. So maybe we can illustrate the distinction to put a bit more flesh on it. So let's take a case that's due to Cody, and Cody imagines a situation where you know that somebody has been manipulated in various ways to try to deceive you. And you know that you've got a whole background story, essentially. So Cody imagines that there's a master criminal who sets about some complex plot, and as part of this complex plot, a testifier tells you that P, where you know that the testifier is lying to you and telling you that P, but because you know all of the background story and you know that there's a series of manipulations involved, you know that the fact that they've said that P actually is evidence that P is true. Okay, so in this case, what Cody says is that you believe what is said, but you don't believe what is said on the basis of the authority of the speaker. You don't believe the speaker in any way. You believe what is said because you know the background story, you know that there's a master criminal at work and it's the complex manipulation and so on and so forth. So this is a case where you merely believe what is said. Okay, you merely believe what is said, you don't believe the speaker. Okay, so, and we have this everyday distinction, I think, between believing somebody because you are crediting them, you're taking them as an authority, and believing what someone has said because you've reasoned to the truth of what they said, where the premise that they said it is just one part of your reasoning. Okay, so we've got a distinction between believing the speaker and merely believing what is said. I've illustrated that distinction. Now we just put a bit more flesh on the bone. So as I'm going to understand it, to believe what is said, to believe the content of what is said, you're viewing the testimony as a piece of evidence. You're seeing it objectively, and you're going to be justified in believing what is said on the basis of the reasons that you have for taking a bit of testimony to be a piece of evidence. Right. So in the complex deceiver case, you've got various background beliefs that establish that bit of testimony is evidence for its truth. And that's the way that we can reason about testimony generally. We can reason to the truth of a piece of testimony from the premise that the speaker said it, where various background beliefs that we have suggest that the speaker saying it is evidence. And when we reason in this way, what we're doing is we're maintaining our epistemic autonomy. We're not in any way deferring to the speaker. We're not deferring to them because our reason for believing what is said comes from our background beliefs to the effect that they're saying it is evidence for its truth. And so what's doing the justificatory work is the background beliefs that we have, which establishes a bit of testimony to be evidenced by our lives. Conversely, there's a sense in which we can defer to a speaker and we can believe what is said because we believe them. And in believing them, we're trusting them for the truth in some matter, we're taking them to be an authority, and we're engaging now, not as a scientist might engage the world, looking at things objectively, but we're engaging as a participant. So when we tell one another things, we expect their reason to belief to be just the fact that we kind of stand behind our utterance and we offer our authority for what we say. Okay, so there's a distinction then between believing a speaker and merely believing what is said, and this distinction, I think, tracks different ways in which we can approach the utterances of others. Okay, now let me look at expert testimony. And what I'm interested in where we engage with expert testimony where things matter to us. Okay, so let me take a couple of examples. And I've chosen a couple of personal examples just because they're live for me. So I'm having a series of house renovations done, and I have to engage a tradesman. And I've obviously thought long and hard about what tradesman to engage. And I've asked other people who've had building work, and I've got recommendations, and I've had the people around, and I've listened carefully to what they've said. And then I've got second opinions, and I've listened carefully to what they said. And I've kind of evaluated their credibility carefully. Another case would be engaging a doctor. So I'm a runner who's injured, and this is very galling for me. And so to try and find resolutions to the injury, I've engaged various different medical professions. And again, I've gone from recommendations from other runners and listened carefully to what they said and checked it all out on the internet and so on and so forth. Okay, so in these kinds of cases, I think that the following setup is true. So I've made a significant endeavour to assess the credibility of the speakers, and I have engaged in enough cognitive work that I can argue to the truth of what these speakers say on the basis of the background assessment that I've done, whereby I see their utterance as one bit of evidence. So the fact that, say, the builder has said that P is evidence for the truth of P, given all of the other background evidence I have based on my assessment of their credibility as builders. But equally, I know that my evidence only goes so far, right? So I can work out to a certain extent what has to be done in the building work. But when they say to me, look, when they explain the reasons why the soil pipe can't go here and it has to go there, then the evidence that I have doesn't support that conclusion. It supports the conclusion that they're credible, but it doesn't support the truth of what it is that they say. My evidence doesn't take me that far. It's not the evidence that they have for the truth of what they say. And so it seems that at a certain point I can choose whether or not just to put my faith in them. Right? My evidence takes me a certain way. It isn't evidence for the truth of what they say, it's just evidence for their credibility. And at a certain point I can then choose whether or not to believe them, whether or not to put my faith in them. And so I think as audiences we face the practical problem of experts present us with a practical problem, and that is deciding who to believe. And they also present us with a practical problem of deciding whether or not to cede epistemic authority. Yeah, and at what point to cede epistemic authority? Do we only believe them on the basis of only believe what's said on the basis of the evidence, or do we somehow put our faith in the speakers? And if we do put our faith in the speakers, at what point do we put our faith in the speakers? Okay. Now, I want to suggest then that there's a datum. I want to take this as a starting datum. There's two ways in which we can approach a piece of testimony. We can treat it as evidence, and we can put the faith in the speaker. In the cases of expert testimony where they matter to us, we significantly do a bit of significant epistemic work to try and work out the credibility for what's said. But nevertheless, we still confront this choice as to whether or not to defer or to keep our own counsel. And by keeping our own counsel, I mean to say you believe what is said on the basis of the evidence rather than on the basis of authority. If we do have this choice, it would seem that we have a choice between two different ways in which our belief can be epistemically justified. Our belief can be epistemically justified on the basis of the evidence of our assessment, insofar as we're keeping our own counsel, or our belief is justified because we've given over authority to the expert and we're believing it just on the authority of the expert. And if there's two ways in which our belief could be justified, then we have agency in the sense that we've got a choice as to which route to knowledge we're going to choose. Now, this is not going to be compatible with various theories of epistemic justification. So it's not going to be compatible with reliabilisms, for example. So reliabilism would say that the belief is justified on the basis of the reliability of your route to belief. And if you've got two different routes to belief, then they're going to be associated with two different reliabilities. And what reliabilism would say is just one of these routes is going to be mandated, namely the one which is most reliable. And arguably it's not going to be compatible with a justificationist view, insofar as a justificationist view would say that the belief is going to be justified by the reasons to support it. Well, if there's two different routes to belief, they're going to be associated with two different degrees of rational support, and again, one of them is going to be mandated, the one which has the greatest degree of rational support. So for these cases, there might be a choice. You might have a choice between believing on the basis of the evidence or believing on the basis of authority, but there isn't any agency and no epistemic agency involved, because of these choices, one of them is going to be epistemologically prescribed. So I think that we do have epistemic agency, and I don't think it's the case that one of these things is epistemically prescribed. But to show how that's going to be compatible with epistemology, I want to look at the epistemology of disagreement. Okay, so let's start off with the epistemology of peer disagreement. So much of this I assume is familiar, but I'll run through it quickly. So peer disagreement starts from cases where you and someone you judge to have the same evidence and have the same competencies as you comes to a different conclusion. So an example that's familiar in the literature is you're in a restaurant and you split the bill. There's 5 of you, and you add the tip on and you do the arithmetic, and you come to the conclusion that each of us owe $43, and your colleague comes to the conclusion you each owe $45. So what should you do in that kind of situation? Well, in order to get that question started, you have to put into the background that you are peers, that you do think you're in the same position epistemically, that you have the same evidence, that you have the same competencies. If it was the case that you were testing your young child, a 6-year-old who isn't very good at division, then you wouldn't have any. The fact that they come to a different conclusion wouldn't be in any way normatively troubling. Or if you used a calculator and you were sure you put the numbers in correctly, then again the fact that someone comes to a different conclusion wouldn't be troubling. You think, well, look, I just used the calculator. But if you're peers and you've come to a different conclusion, then it does seem to be troubling. And what's the right? And the question that the epistemology of disagreement is centred on is what's the right response to such cases of peer disagreement? And it seems that there's a choice. Either you assume that you're both as likely to be wrong as each other, in which case you're going to suspend judgment pending a recalculation, or you think pending a recalculation, the other person must have made a mistake. So those are the two ways that we can go, where the former view is sometimes known as the conciliationist or equal weight view, and the latter view is sometimes known as a non-conciliationist or steadfast view. Okay, so what motivates the conciliationist view, that we should suspend judgment, is just the idea that we're fallible, and I'm just as fallible as you. So if we're peers, then I'm just as likely to be wrong as you. So unless I've got an independent reason for thinking that you're wrong, I should give your view equal weight, and so I suspend judgment. The idea behind the non-conciliation view is that, look, someone's got to be right. And so if you have calculated correctly, the fact that you've calculated correctly should make some kind of epistemic difference. It should make it reasonable for you to hold steadfast to your view. So the question then for the steadfast view is, well, on what occasions is it right for you to hold steadfast? Yeah, so you say you've calculated correctly, but under what conditions of calculating correctly is it enough for you to hold fast to your view and not be moved by disagreement? And then there's been significant debate about how to identify those occasions when it's reasonable to hold steadfast. Okay, so I want to offer an answer to that question. And to offer that answer, I want to go back to the case of expert testimony. And in particular, now I want to consider a third-person case of disagreement in contrast to a first-person case. So a first-person case of disagreement is the cases that have preoccupied the literature. And those are cases when I believe that P, and then I confront someone who I take to be at time t0, I believe that P, and then at time t1, I confront someone whom I take to be my peer who believes that not P. Okay, so a case of third-party disagreement is that I ask an expert whether P. The expert tells me that P at time 0 or time 1, and then later on, I confront another expert who says the opposite. Right, so it's a third-party version, a third-person version of the first-person case. The first-person case has me, the subject, believing that P at one time and then later confronting a peer who thinks otherwise. The third-person case has me, the layperson, confronting an expert that believes one thing, and then at a later time confronting an expert that believes something else. Okay, so let's go back to the tradesman case and the builder case. And suppose that, having reasoned about whether or not to believe the builder, I decide that I'm going to base my belief on their authority. I'm going to put my faith in them. Suppose that that's the way that I go. I've put my faith in the builder, and I've come to believe that P. And then I have another builder around, and the other builder says that not P. Now let's suppose that the first builder knows that P. Well, in this case, the first builder knows that P, and I've put my confidence in them, right? Then it seems that I know that P. I know that P in the ordinary way in which we get to know on the basis of trust, by putting our faith in other people that know. Right? So I've put my faith in someone that knows, and by that means I've got to know. So I know that P, and now I've confronted another expert who says that not P. Now in this case, it seems that even though I know that P, it's not sufficient for me to hold steadfast in the face of this other expert who says that not P. In this case, in this third-party case, it seems that my knowledge isn't sufficient for me to hold steadfast because, well, it's just a historical accident that I confronted one builder's testimony first, the first builder's testimony first, and the second builder's testimony second. I could have confronted the testimonies the other way round, and if I'd confronted the testimonies the other way round, I would have believed not P rather than P. And insofar as it's just a historical accident that I believe that P rather than not P, then it's going to be dogmatic for me to persist in believing that P in the face of the second builder's testimony not P. So it's not reasonable for me to remain steadfast in my belief, even though what I know amounts to knowledge. Okay, so if we're trying to give an account of when is it reasonable to be steadfast, it seems that the third-party case suggests that knowledge isn't sufficient to support being steadfast. Okay, now let's look at another third-party case. So let's take the medical case. So I'm an injured runner and I want to get resolved, so I go and see this consultant, and this consultant says that P, but in this time I'm not willing to put my faith in this person. I'm not going to believe it just because they said it. I'm going to believe it because I've done all of the background legwork. I've checked on the internet, I've worked out this injury, I've assessed the credibility, the whole thing seems plausible, and I'm going to I'm going to believe that P because I can give an argument to the truth of P, where their testimony figures as a premise, but what's doing the justificatory work is the fact that I can give this argument. All right. And let's suppose that the doctor does know that, suppose again the doctor does know that P. So in this case, there's another case where I know that P, but in this case I know that P not because I've ceded any authority, but because I take myself to have given an argument to the truth of what I believe. And now I confront the second consultant surgeon and who says that not P. And in this case, it seems that I think I do have some grounds for rejecting what they say. I've got some grounds because I've given an argument. My belief is based upon an argument to the truth of what I believe. And insofar as this argument makes it reasonable to believe that P, it equally makes it reasonable to start from the presumption that not P is false. Insofar as my belief is based on an argument for its truth, the argument that supports my belief equally supports me starting from the presumption that any things to the contrary of what I believe are false. If the arguments didn't do that, if the arguments didn't close questions for us, then if we were continually doxastically open, if arguments didn't close questions, then the cognitive life would be unlivable. Okay, but a presumption is still that doesn't mean I'm justified in believing not P is false, but I can start from the presumption not P is false. And in starting from the presumption, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and think of other explanations as to why it is that the second consultant got things wrong. Yeah, maybe they're not really sensitive to what goes on with runners. I mean, their surgeons are too quick to think that this, and so on and so forth. I'm going to try and explain away their testimony. Right? I'm going to try and take what antecedently I would have seen as a bit of evidence and leach out its evidential value. So that's to say that if we, in the previous situation, I imagined two different causal histories. A causal history of believing on authority, the first person, and then the second person, and then a causal history of believing on authority, the second person and the first person. And I said that there's this complete symmetry between those causal histories, and so therefore it's dogmatic just to believe the first because they encountered first. But insofar as we do cognitive work when we encounter the second, then there's not going to be a complete symmetry between these different causal histories. There's going to be these different causal histories are going to generate a different it's going to generate evidential difference. So this is the point that Kelly has made at length in one of his papers. And what I'm suggesting is it offers grounds for steadfastness. I'm not saying steadfastness is justified across the board, but it offers some grounds for steadfastness. Okay, so listen, what I suggested then is that knowledge isn't sufficient for steadfastness, but warrant does offer some ground for steadfastness. But then how could it be that warrant could be sufficient for steadfastness when knowledge isn't? Right, that kind of doesn't make sense. Well, I think it does if we start to differentiate different dimensions of warrant. So in particular, I want to differentiate a dimension of strength versus a dimension of transparency. So if we say that a subject's belief S enjoys warrant on the basis of certain facts, we can say the strength of the warrant is the degree to which those facts render the belief probable, in the objective sense. So the strength of the warrant is the degree to which the facts upon which your belief is based render your belief objectively probable. The transparency of the warrant is the degree to which you're aware of the facts and you're aware that the facts determine the truth of your belief, determine the warrant. Okay. So strength, if you like, is an externalist construal of epistemic warrant. Transparency is an internalist construal of epistemic warrant. And what I think that the third person cases of disagreement show is that they show that these two dimensions of warrant pull apart. So in the building case, where I believe the first builder on the authority of what they say, and they know what they're saying, then I get to know what they're saying, and the warrant that my belief inherits is the warrant that they have, and insofar as they know what they're talking about, my warrant gets to be based upon the best kind of possible reasons. My warrant gets to be based upon the evidence that they have, the reasons that they have for saying what they do. So the strength of my warrant is very high because it's based upon their reasons, and their reasons are reasons for the best reasons that they could be for the truth of the proposition. But my belief is based on trust, and trust is kind of blind, really. I'm just ceding authority to the person. So I get the best possible reasons in terms of strength, but these reasons are entirely opaque to me. They're entirely non-transparent to me, because knowledge based on trust is blind. Whereas in the consultant case, by contrast, because I'm basing my belief on an argument for the truth that I have articulated, the warrant is entirely transparent to me, but the warrant is much less strong than it would be if I'd based it on authority. Because the reasons that I have are really just reasons for thinking that the consultant is credible. Whereas the reasons that a consultant has are reasons that bear upon the truth of the proposition that they present. So the reasons that they have are much better than my reasons. So their reasons are much stronger. My belief isn't based on their reasons because I'm basing it on my reasons, because I'm basing it on my argument. My argument's what's doing the justificatory work. So what we have is a very low strength of warrant, but a very high transparency of warrant. Okay, so what I'm proposing then is what's needed for steadfastness, what underpins steadfastness, what makes steadfastness reasonable, is when you have warrant for your belief that's highly transparent for you. And I think that in all of the cases in the first person epistemology of disagreement that argue for the steadfastness view and bring up cases supporting the intuition that it's reasonable to be steadfast, all of those cases are based upon cases where the warrant is highly transparent. So in the first person cases, it's the transparency of warrant that's doing the epistemic work. Okay, so let's go back to the case where I've got this choice between believing on the basis of my cognitive work or putting my faith in the speaker. And I've said that this manifests epistemic agency because both of these routes to belief are justified. And I said that this is not compatible with theories of justification like reliabilism or justificationism. And I think that that's true because these theories only allow for one axis of epistemic evaluation. Beliefs are justified because they're reliable. Beliefs are justified because they're supported by reasons. But what I'm suggesting is that there's different axes of epistemic evaluation where each axis can be rationally motivated. So there's a reason for deferring to authority. Then the reason for deferring authority is because you get a belief which is strongly warranted, and strength of warrant matters, right? We want our beliefs to be supported by the best possible reasons. And the best possible reasons are not reasons that we possess, they're the reasons that someone else possesses. So we've got a reason for deferring. But equally, we've got a reason for maintaining our own epistemic autonomy. Because in maintaining our epistemic autonomy, we're not kind of blown by the winds of chance so much, as it were. Transparency matters. Transparency renders our belief more secure, and it supports a degree of steadfastness. It supports a presumption of steadfastness, and that's something that matters for us. Okay. So what I'm suggesting then is there's two axes of these two axes of warrant correspond to, if you like, two different epistemic norms. So the idea that there's different epistemic norms, I think, is familiar from, look, you maximise the truths believed is one epistemic norm. Minimise the falsehood believed is another. I'm suggesting that there's two more. Be autonomous in belief is an epistemic norm. And this, what it demands, is it demands that we base our beliefs on our own articulations of the evidence, on the arguments that we can offer for the truth of things. But there's equally a maxim which says, believe those who know authoritatively, right? And this, I think, is a maxim because it's epistemically motivated. It's motivated by the idea that we want our beliefs to be supported by the best possible reasons. And I suggest that when we confront expert testimony, we essentially feel the pull of both of these epistemic norms. We want to believe on authority because we want to get our beliefs supported by the best possible reasons, and we want our beliefs to inherit those reasons. We want to be able to defer to the expert, to hold them responsible for our believing. But equally, we want to think things through for ourselves. We don't just want to be blown by the winds of chance, as it were. So I think that we've got a practical problem when we confront epistemic authority, and that's whether or not to cede our authority, who to believe, and then when we believe them, whether or not to cede our authority. These are hard practical problems. But underlying the latter practical problem, I also want to suggest there's an epistemic problem, and the epistemic problem is what norm should we be guided by in our confrontation with expert testimony. Okay, so that's the end, and that's, as I said, apologetically that the papers come out as agents in disagreement. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have 10 minutes for questions.
Hi, thanks a lot. So I have a question. I don't know if I misunderstood something, or maybe I am a little naive there. So the thing is, on the asymmetry you see between the two cases, right? Yeah. So my question is, if I consult one doctor, he gives me some P, I make an argument on that P, and when I consult the second doctor, if I'm reasonable, I should say, well, I've got these good reasons to believe this stuff, then he might be that he's wrong, or she is wrong, right? Mm-hmm. But it doesn't seem to me, it seems to me that it still relies on the historical kind of order, mm-hmm. because if we suppose from the beginning that they are kind of expert peers, mm-hmm. were I to consult the first one, mm-hmm. and I make an argument on mm-hmm. what he says, mm-hmm. then I should have good reasons to mm-hmm. Hold steadfast mm-hmm. on the first. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't seem, I don't see the signature. Right?
Yeah, no, you're right to push him at that point, because it's a crucial point on the paper. So the idea here is meant to be. But let me put it. So Kelly uses the term evidence construed narrowly versus evidence construed broadly. So let me borrow his terms to see if that helps. So when he says evidence construed broadly, he wants to include not merely the evidential value of the relevant fact, but also the realm of alternative hypotheses that fact exists within that are being entertained. So that would include other possible explanations, where other explanations include other explanations of that fact. So the idea then is that it's true that it is a matter of historical accident which expert you encounter first, but the reason this makes it different in the case where you're doing cognitive work, where your belief is based upon your evaluations, is that having argued for the truth of this proposition, that generates an entitlement for you to it generates entitlement for you to start your reasoning from the presumption that other things are false, and that entitles you to look for other explanatory hypotheses of why the second medical practitioner has said what you take to be false. And once you've kind of entertaining other explanatory hypotheses of why why they might say what they say is false, then what you're doing is you're decreasing in terms of the total evidence as opposed to the evidence narrowly construed. You're in effect decreasing the evidential value of their statement at the same time as kind of increasing the evidential value of the previous statement. So even though it's an accident as to the time order in which you encounter the testimonies, the causal history makes an evidential difference because it's going to determine how you reason with respect to the second testimony. And the idea is just that this way of reasoning carries with it the entitlement that you inherit by virtue of basing your belief on an argument, whereas in the trust-based case, you're just accepting things on faith. So there's a perfect parity between the different causal histories.
Yeah. Super quick. The only thing is that, so if what you say is right, I think I mean I see the entitlement thing, but on the other hand, if I don't close the question, if I don't think I settled the question there,
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel like I have the entitlement to say, well, now let's consult the second one, but
Mm-hmm.
starting with the presumption that he's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, I wouldn't go for it. Right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, sure. Okay, so for sure. So these entitlements and these presumptions are defeasible, and you're right. If insofar as I present the case as my seeking out a second opinion, then definitely they're going to be highly defeasible. We could have it that they will be less defeasible, say, if it's not me seeking a second opinion, but I just encounter a second opinion. But yeah, no, for sure. Yeah.
So my question was basically on the same point. Maybe just let me try to push a little bit further. So, do you think this is really how we should reason if we've encountered the testimony and we've used it to form an argument, and then we encounter new testimony that contradicts the previous testimony? Of course, it depends what role the first testimony is playing exactly in the argument. But if I sort of evaluate my situation, it seems to me that the way I should reason is just to think, well, I have no better reason to hold on to the first belief over the second belief.
So I think you could reach that as a conclusion, yes. So again, these are defeasible claims, but do I think that you should start your reasoning from the presumption that your previous argument for the truth was a successful one? Yeah, and I think one should. And if one didn't start from that presumption, then I don't think then I think believing would be impossible. Right? If if an argument didn't close the question for you whether or not something is true, right, then I don't know what ever could close the question of whether or not something is true. Now, obviously, closing the question here doesn't mean instituting a form of dogmatism, but what it does mean is it means starting from the presumption that what you the opposite of what you concluded is false, and then as soon as you start from that presumption, then what you're going to then do is then you're going to try and look for hypotheses, other explanatory hypotheses as to why that might be so, and as soon as you've done that, then you've generated a difference, evidentially, between the different causal histories. So these points are defeasible, and they can be highly defeasible, and to the extent one's uncertain, they're going to be highly defeasible. But nevertheless, I think what they're doing is they're offering you normative ground for rational ground for being steadfast, which you simply don't have in the case of trust. And what I'm suggesting that the ground comes from is it comes from the transparency of the warrant, the fact that you've gone through you've made these argumentative moves yourself. So yes, I would be committed to thinking that's the way it should be, but yes, it is. These things are defeasible, and to the extent that one is uncertain, then it would equally be dogmatic just to persist with belief.
We have very many questions left. Ed?
Okay, so this might just be an invitation to say a bit more. So it was really how these norms meant to interact when they come to conflict.
Right.
So
Yeah.
my thought was just mixing up the cases a bit. So you have the first case where you trust the speaker.
Yeah.
So I know from the other word that's recognising their intention to adopt a kind of responsibility for
Yeah.
the belief that you have.
Yeah.
So it looks, we want to say that you can gain knowledge in this way.
Yeah.
So come to know what the tradesman tells you by trusting them.
Yeah.
So you do this, and then you think, well, you come across another tradesman, but you decide, like, I'm not going to trust this one. Though, as it happens, you build a situation and get loads of evidence that they're really reliable. You know what we're talking about. So then you have a good argument to the truth of their claim, but their claim's in conflict with the number.
Yeah.
So what should one do in that case, given that you've already gained knowledge?
Okay. Okay. So I think insofar as you've believed on the basis of trust in the first case, then even though and supposing that the first person didn't know what they were talking about, and therefore you know what you believed, then so what I want to suggest is that even though you know, your knowledge doesn't give you any entitlement to reject what the second builder says. You could then gain an entitlement to reject what the second builder says by arguing for the falsity of what they said. But then what would be supporting your rejection would be the argument that you'll be giving then, rather than the knowledge that you have now. Would there be something bad? Would there be a kind of a bad faith involved in that, or?
So I was just wondering whether you could defeat that by just saying, "Well, they told me."
Oh, wait, with
that's
you.
the reason.
Okay. So, right, I'm with you. So your idea is I can just reject. I can just use deference as a way of yeah. So honestly, I think that that's what you would say that in that situation, wouldn't you? But I mean, so I had a first person here, and that's what they said to me. You know, so you would say that. That's right. I guess what I'm arguing here is that whilst this idea of deference is knowledge supporting ordinarily, it comes unstuck in this case. And so in a way I'm saying there's something illegitimate about that. I think you would make that move in a sense to give you evidence to know what to think, wouldn't you?
Unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions. Sorry for those who didn't catch. But thank you for your talk.
Okay, thank you.
Well.
That's great.
So our next speaker today, you need.
Yeah, so what we should do is we'll just do. Yeah. Excellent. We good to go?
Should I do something on nothing else, right?
It's all still going. That's fine.
So I'm pleased to introduce Michel Gauchet, who's a researcher at the University of Edinburgh. He's going to talk today about what is an expert, a service conception of epistemic authority.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks, Maria. Thanks, Carlo, for this great event. Thanks for having me here. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is, for no reason, kind of new. I mean, we've been talking a lot about defining what it takes to be an expert. So, in a sense, I'm kind of engaging and challenging some kind of topics that have already been discussed here. And what I hope to do is offer some kind of interesting or maybe kind of original insights with my strategy, that is that of distinguishing between kind of two main approaches that have been proposed by several people in particular, but Alvin Goldman in two different, or maybe more than two different occasions. And both approaches are based on the idea of the conceptual function of expertise. On the one hand, I will put forth this idea of the novice-oriented function, according to which the expert basically has to kind of provide novices with accurate information or knowledge. Whereas we can also have this research-oriented function, according to which experts are mainly focused on contributing to the epistemic progress of the discipline they work in. My aim in the end is showing that, especially for our specific philosophical purposes, it's better to consider experts as according to the research-oriented account of function that I'm gonna lay down on the table right now. So here is a very quick plan. I will define with these two ideas of the twofold service of experts. In the end, I put this service thing on the title, and I'm always talking about function, but it's kind of the same for the purposes of the talk. So after doing that, I will try to refine the novice-oriented account, which is kind of the mainstream account, I would say, at least in the Goldman and other people in social epistemology work. I will try to have the best version of it laid down on the table before saying that, according to me, it doesn't work very well. And that's what I'm going to do in the third section, and then if I have time, I will offer some concluding remarks. Okay. So here is a fundamental assumption, which is kind of the grounding assumption of the whole project. According to Goldman, a very recent paper of him, a compelling definition of the expert has to reflect their function within an epistemic community. So it should highlight what expertise is by reference to what expert can do for lay people by means of their special knowledge. So if we want to explain this a little bit more, we can say that any account of expertise should provide a definition of the expert, so it has to include the definition requirement, but also explain how this definition fits the function of expertise assumed by its proponent, and this is the function requirement. Okay, so let's see the novice-oriented account first. The novice-oriented account includes a veritistic definition of the expert. According to this definition, a subject S is an expert in a domain D if and only if S has more true belief and fewer false beliefs in proposition pertaining to the domain than do most people. The TLC thing is a truth-linked condition. Veritistic condition is Goldman uses both things, both expressions. The function of the expert, according to this account, the subject, the expert, need to have the capacity to help other people solve a variety of problems in the domain or execute an assortment of tasks in the domain which they would not be able to solve or execute on their own. And she can provide this help by imparting to the layperson his or her distinctive knowledge or skills. Okay, interesting enough, time ago, Goldman has an alternative, I think a stronger analysis of the expert. I'm briefly quoting from him. He said, experts are people who have or claim to have a superior quantity or level of knowledge in some domain, plus an ability to generate new knowledge in answer to questions within the domain. And this is what I take to be the basic, the core of the research-oriented account. Because according to this account, a subject is an expert insofar as she fulfills the veritistic condition, so the same condition we have on the novice-oriented account, plus the ability condition. So the expert needs to possess the ability to generate new knowledge in answer to questions within the domain. And according to this account, what is the function of the expert on this account? The expert needs to have the capacity to contribute to the progress of the domain, and she can provide such help by offering true answers to the questions that are coming up in the domain. Okay, so here is just to very quickly compare the two accounts. Both share the veritistic condition. The research-oriented account, I take it to be stronger because there's this additional requirement, and they have a different or alternative function requirement. Okay, so let's get started with the idea of improving the novice-oriented account offered by Goldman and other people. So the first thing to note is the following. This is kind of a worry that has been raised by David Cody a few years ago and other people as well. So some might think that this veritistic condition makes the notion of expertise subject-dependent, in the sense that the attribution of expertise to someone depends, at least in part, on the reliability of most people most members of the epistemic community. So basically they say, well, you should add to the definition the idea that do most people in their epistemic community or something like that. Obviously, Goldman is aware of this possibility, is aware that we could use the notion of the expert in a comparative sense. We obviously can say things like Anna is more of an expert in psychology than Nick, or Mary is the most expert person on football tactics in the classroom, or something like that. But what he wants to say is something more specific. In both the papers, that is in the first paper in which he endorses a research-oriented account, and the other in which endorses a novice-oriented account, is explicit that we need to add a non-comparative clause or a threshold condition, call it as you prefer, meaning that being an expert is not simply a matter of veritistic superiority. We need to add some non-comparative threshold of veritistic attainment. He is also explicit, this is kind of a bracket, he's also explicit that it's not easy to set this threshold in real cases, and it doesn't engage too much in this kind of hard work, probably because it's hard. Okay, so the first problem concerns the very kind of idea of that the veritistic condition relies on. So in the most recent version of this veritistic condition, someone is an expert insofar as she possesses more true beliefs than most people do in a domain, plus less false beliefs in the same domain. He has a different version in the previous paper, which I'm not going to discuss here because this is enough. The question that we might want to raise here is that actually we might not need this second horn of the condition because, well, expert definitely fulfill the first norm. They definitely need to have more true belief than the majority of people in a domain. But if they are kind of working in the advance of a domain, if they are trying to put forth new theories, they might run the risk of assuming more false beliefs. They might try to believe falsehoods that lay people just don't have. The idea is that TLC2 might not be a necessary condition for one to be an expert. And I think that this is, I guess, a point raised also by Schultz and maybe a few other people. It's not a super original point, but I think it's important though, because it allows us to get rid of the second horn of the condition and say, okay, it's better for you, if you want to have a novice-oriented account, that you just say that in order for one to be an expert, they have to possess more true beliefs than most people do, without caring about the number of false beliefs that they have to possess. But here is a more interesting and troubling problem. I couldn't come up with a shorter example, so I'm going to run through the long version I have here. So suppose that Danny is someone who's has a very special talent for remembering and decides to help his lazy brother Brett pass his physiology licensing examination. This is a very hard exam with a random selection of 100 multiple choice questions that each candidate receives on their laptop at the beginning of the exam. And they have to answer it in a very short amount of time, obviously. All the candidates know is that the computer selects among a huge list of 10,000 questions or something like that are published on the licensing examination website. And Danny, the talented brother, offers to memorize the whole list of 10,000 questions with each respective correct answer and to provide Brett with the list of correct replies to the test he receives on his laptop, short after getting kind of a screenshot of the list itself. So the idea is that in the end, Danny manages to get Brett past the exam with a very good score, simply by knowing by heart what were the correct replies to the question they were on the test. So let's think about Danny's profile a little bit. Danny satisfies the veritistic condition by hypothesis. We assume that he definitely has much more true beliefs in physiology than most people do. And we can also say that the number of true beliefs he has in physiology is so big that he fulfills even kind of an objective version of this condition. And furthermore, Danny seems to fulfill the novice-oriented function because he does great service to his brother and potentially is in the position to do this service to any other people who might need it. Nonetheless, I hope you agree with me that we shouldn't consider Danny an expert in physiology. Okay, there are a couple ways to show that Danny lacks expertise in the field. The first way is just to say that Danny has a lot of true yet unjustified beliefs. I don't think this way is very promising. First of all, because it's unclear whether Goldman and other people take expert to possess justified true belief, or to say it better, require expert to possess justified true beliefs. But most of all, is kind of evident to me that Danny acquires all this information from a reliable source, and so we might want to say that he has testimonial knowledge of this proposition. I think it's much more interesting to think about the notion of understanding of a subject matter, of a discipline as physiology is. Here I'm kind of referring of a specific version of understanding, which is called objectual understanding. If we want to give a definition, objectual understanding might be defined as grasping systematic connections among elements of a complex whole, or gaining insight into certain relations between items within a larger body of information. And I think that this is kind of intuitive, that the most plausible measure of someone's expertise in a field is their understanding of the background assumption of the domain, understanding of the main question that arise within the domain, and the understanding of the available answers. So if you are on board with me with this, it seems that we can say that Danny lacks expertise in physiology because he has no understanding whatsoever of how the thousands of true beliefs he has relate to each other. Therefore, we might want to do this in service of Goldman's novice-oriented account and say that it's better to refine the definition, the veritistic definition, and say that the subject is an expert in a domain insofar as she possesses a largely better understanding of the domain than most people do. Okay, now someone can obviously come up with the question, which is better understanding, how you measure it. I just ask you to believe me that I'm going to endorse kind of a Kate Elgin view according to which understanding can vary along breadth, along depth, and significance. I'm not going to go into these details because for the sake of time, I'd say. I still have around 12, 13, 15. Is that right?
Yeah, we have until 3:45. Yeah, good. 30 minutes.
30?
Including question and answer.
Yeah, so, okay, cool. Okay, cool. So yeah, the idea is that this notion of objective understanding varies along degrees, and so we can make it work for the comparison between the expert and the lay people and most people in a domain. Okay, so here's the thing. Obviously, on the understanding, the debate on understanding is pretty interesting because there are people who endorse factive notion of understanding and people who endorse a non-factive notion of understanding. I'm going to try to say a couple of things that might I try to kind of get both people on board with me. First, the factivists about understanding. According to them, a subject has understanding of a domain D only insofar as most of the proposition and all of the central proposition of the domain are true. So, factivists about understanding, this is interesting for our purposes, do not violate the veritistic scope of Goldman's account. So Goldman's want to define experts with a veritistic definition. And I'm saying, okay, factivists about understanding can allow us to do that because we can say that a subject is an expert insofar as she has a broader, deeper, and more significant grip on the relationship between the true bodies of information that constitute the domain than most people do. If we can plug in this true idea in the bodies of information part component of the understanding, we can fulfill or respect Goldman's intuition. But there are people who just don't want to buy this. I'm kind of going back to Christian's talk in a sense. There are people who think that we can have understanding of a domain even when neither most of the proposition nor all of the central proposition of the domain are true. There's the Copernicus example. I'm going to skip that. It was on the board before. The idea is that those who buy a non-factivist account of understanding, well, first of all, they would agree that experts can have more false beliefs than lay people in the domain. That's something I said before. But they would also hold kind of an anti-veritistic account of the expert. They would say that cognitive expertise is a matter of possessing better non-factive understanding of a domain rather than having true beliefs in the domain. Okay, what this is supposed to mean? In the end, why should we go for this non-factive notion, which is kind of weird in a sense? Here is something that might be helpful in this respect. So there's this idea that obviously veritism about understanding commits us to denying that one can be an expert in pseudoscience, where like in parapsychology, phrenology, or astrology, all these things. However, and here I'm trying to put forward this idea a little bit, there are kinds of pseudoscience. What I have in mind, we might want to dispute that, and I'm interested in hearing what you think about this, but there are kinds of pseudoscience. I'm taking here homeopathy or neurolinguistic programming, for instance, that currently receive public support by national and international institutions in several countries, Europe included. Thus, it might be appropriate from an epistemic point of view and a social point of view to distinguish, if we can, between people who have some kind of cognitive expertise in these fields and people that lack it. Obviously, non-factivists about understanding allow us to do that. They allow us to say that a pseudoscientist is an expert insofar as she has better non-factive understanding of the subject matter than most people do. And since she endorsed a non-factive account of understanding, there's no problem in the fact that the pseudoscience discipline is hugely made of false propositions. Obviously, veritists cannot do that. And what I want to point out here is that I don't think I'm committed in any way to endorsing either of these positions. I'm just trying to say, no matter what you think about, no matter what is your idea of understanding, you can have a good reason to endorse my view. Okay, so why, after all this work, I should just get rid of the novice-oriented account? The first thing I want to point out is that there's the two functions, the novice-oriented function and the research-oriented function, to me are very different things. So different that they rely on very different kind of epistemic abilities that allow one to fulfill the function. So I suggest to distinguish between these two sets of abilities. The novice-oriented abilities, so those virtues that allow an expert to address the lay people dependency on them, are things like sensitivity to the novice's needs, intellectual generosity, empathy, sensitivity to the novice epistemic resources, and so on and so forth. Whereas the research-oriented abilities, those are virtues that allow someone to give a contribution to the discussion of a discipline, to the progress of the discipline, are totally different kind of abilities. Stuff like intellectual curiosity, creativity, courage, open-mindedness, firmness, autonomy, and you can have more things to say on that. What I want to point out is that Goldman, who somehow seems to endorse two different views at the same time, or who changes his mind, he needs to have in mind two very different ideas of function that the expert seems to be required to possess, right? But here is the problem. The problem is whether someone who lacks novice-oriented abilities but has developed a good range of research-oriented abilities should be considered an expert. I think it already came up in earlier talks that someone might be unable to figure out what a layperson doesn't understand of their theories. Someone might be unable to proportionate their answer to the novice's question. They might overestimate the novice's background or underestimate the novice's background. And someone might be unable to help lay people out in improving their understanding of a domain. All these are ways in which someone fails to display novice-oriented abilities. Nonetheless, it seems to me that they might be very good at fulfilling the research-oriented function. So they might be very good at working in their field and give a positive contribution to the progress of their field. So, but this might seem like very terminological dispute. So we might just want to say, okay, just depending on what you think is the most important function, you define the expert this way and we settle the issue, right? I think that Goldman cannot do that insofar as he wants to hold fast on his assumption. So according to him, an account of the expert needs to explain what experts are by showing how the definition of the expert fits the function experts are supposed to perform. So what I want to suggest is that on novice-oriented accounts, the definition requirement fails to fit the function requirement, whereas research-oriented accounts, they do not have this problem. More specifically, I want to say that research-oriented accounts, that novice-oriented accounts cannot capture what it is to be an expert because there are other kind of epistemic subjects that fulfill the novice-oriented function without being experts. And here is the idea I have in mind. I defended this idea elsewhere. Here is how I define epistemic authority. Like a subject who is more reliable in a domain than their interlocutor and who makes use of their novice-oriented abilities to answer the interlocutor question. This subject is an epistemic authority for me in the domain. And what is important to point out here is that, for instance, Annie can be an epistemic authority for Beth in history without being an epistemic authority for Claire in the same field. Plus, Annie can be an epistemic authority for Beth in history without being an expert in that field. So the important thing is that here is that the threshold for being epistemic authorities, we need a minimum threshold to avoid like one foolish person to be an expert or an epistemic authority for another foolish person. But the threshold is definitely lower than the threshold for being expert in the objective sense. If so, then we have people who are authorities because they help interlocutors fulfill achieve some epistemic goal in a domain, so they fulfill the novice-oriented function, but might fail or likely fail to fulfill the truth-link condition of Goldman's oriented account, novice-oriented account. So the idea is that they do not have more true beliefs or better understanding than most people do in a domain, but they do fulfill this requirement only for the specific interlocutor they are talking to. So here is kind of a summary of the thing. Novice-oriented accounts do not comply with the assumption according to which we are supposed to define what is the expert by reference to the function of expertise. On the one hand, the novice-oriented function does not require such a strong definition as the truth-link condition I've been arguing for so far, because epistemic authorities perform this service without fulfilling the condition. But on the other hand, novice-oriented accounts seem kind of committed to such a strong definition because they need to prevent people like epistemic authorities to fulfill the requirements for being experts, to keep the distinction. This is something that the research-oriented accounts, this is a problem that does not affect the research-oriented account, because their function requirement allows us to distinguish experts from other kinds of epistemic subject. Neither lay people nor epistemic authorities can answer a new question arising within a domain of inquiry. They both lack the epistemic competence to contribute to the progress of the discipline. And the definition requirements explain what it takes for one to be in the position to fulfill the function, the research-oriented function, because the veritistic condition illustrates the need for experts to have a much better understanding of a domain than lay people do. And the ability condition explains that one can perform this service insofar as they have these research-oriented abilities. So I want to conclude that if we assume Goldman's idea of the relationship between the definition requirement and the function requirement, it's clear that we should opt for research-oriented accounts rather than novice-oriented accounts. Do I have time for one more slide? Yes. Here is the kind of a conclusion I want to, or kind of an idea, like a spin-off idea I take my proposal might have. I thought about this distinction between expert authorities and obviously an obvious target are teachers, who are people trained to help novices acquire knowledge and understanding in a domain. In the ideal scenario, we'd rather be taught by experts, because if that happens, we are kind of acquiring fresh knowledge and understanding from those who work firsthand in a domain. But there are several real-life scenarios in which great experts prove to be less effective as teachers than trained teachers who have no research-oriented abilities or not enough research-oriented abilities to give a positive contribution to the progress of their discipline. And if this is the setup, I think we'd rather have experts working on the advancing of their fields than spending lots of time teaching novices when they lack the ability to do so. I think that the service expert can do by working on the advancing of their field is very beneficial to the entire epistemic community, and the benefit they will provide is much better, is much greater if they fulfill their research-oriented function than if they try to work or try to become epistemic authorities. And that's it. Thanks.
Some questions?
Yes, I want to ask you something about understanding stuff, but I'll just ask you about that later. So let me ask you about something else. So just about the argument for research-oriented account as opposed to novice-oriented account, based on, as I understood it, the fact that novice-oriented accounts can't really give you a sharp distinction between epistemic authorities and experts. That's
Yes.
more or less right? Okay, and then, so my question really is, well, two parts. Like, first, why is that a good thing? Why would it be better to have a sharp distinction between something like an epistemic authority and an expert, as opposed to just a vague distinction that sort of just runs, well, when does someone start being an expert as opposed to epistemic? There's just no sharp boundary there, it's just a vague. I think at least for someone like me, I just think that's just a pretty natural way of seeing things. That's not a worse account by that mark. And the other question is, why doesn't the same kind of problem arise for research-oriented account? I mean, presumably, like the extent to which you are doing research and are good at that, whatever it is that define those, I wasn't quite following that, but like whatever it is, I would think that's also going to be vague in the same sort of way. You get some cases that are sort of in the boundary, and you might call whatever is on the other side of the boundary, the non-expert side of the boundary, you might call that something else, but there's going to be some vague cases, and so I don't see that there's going to be a sharp distinction there either, really. But
yeah.
If you can ask it either.
Yeah, okay, so probably the most reasonable way to reply to your question is kind of point out a little bit the epistemic authority notion I have. So let's suppose that I've been like going through like first lessons of scuba diving skills or something like that. You know nothing about that. I know just what I learned from these lessons, basic stuff. We discuss about scuba diving. I can definitely be an epistemic authority for you. I can provide a very good service in giving you like the basics of the thing if I'm a kind of a knowledgeable person, but definitely I'm not an expert, right? You wouldn't be willing to say that I am an expert in the field, right? I've no. Well, if you're willing to say that I am an expert in scuba diving simply because I attended 5 or 10 lessons and I'm providing you a service, like saying how you, I don't even know how to say that in English, but how you compensate when you're going like, if for you I'm an expert, then we have kind of a big disagreement here.
I feel like you're asking me like well, who's tall? You know, I feel like you're asking me that sort of kind of question. Like, so this person surely isn't tall, and this other person surely is tall, and then surely there's going to be like this kind of big boundary. And I feel like the same kind of way with this. I mean, give me an example. I'm like, well, I don't know, like what are the standards in that kind of community, or I need some more information about that. I mean, yeah, ordinarily we wouldn't call him an expert, but like in a certain context, you know, we've been sort of, you know, suppose no one here has ever done any course in scuba diving, and I could say, I think truly, you know, you're the expert, you just took the course. Or, I don't really see why that would be problematic as a feature of my account. That would be a completely appropriate thing to say.
I see.
Should we move on, or do you want to?
Well,
Okay,
yeah, we can totally. The only thing is that probably what I want to say is that having like a weaker notion of epistemic authority clear laid down on the table allow at least someone like me who wants to say that there are situations in which you are reasonable in deferring to the authority without them being expert. That kind of picture gives me the opportunity to have more epistemic goals, to gain more epistemic goals in the same time, because I can say, well, you don't need to defer just to experts. You might not have experts around. There are people like less epistemically competent or less epistemically competent from which you can get something. If you don't want to make this distinction, you kind of lose this. I think you kind of lose this advantage. But yeah, we can talk about that.
Mark?
I agree with this. I think that dividing epistemic authority from expert, I think that's just semantic. Like you've made a decision, and I don't think that's a good idea. But okay, what is what? I have a problem with your story about Danny and the.
Oh yes.
You put this guy Danny, and he's learned the answer to 10,000 questions, and you're kind of saying that he's got 10,000 true beliefs about physiology.
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah, I'm a bit uncomfortable with that. He's learned the answer to 10,000 questions. Does he have true beliefs about physiology? He just knows the answers to the questions in the exam. And if you say that he does have true beliefs about physiology, then I want to say he's an expert. If he knows 10,000 different pieces of information about physiology, for me, that makes him an expert. You say he doesn't understand, but I don't know, what is it to understand with physiology? If you know 10,000 things about the body, for me, I know 2 or 3, I know nothing about it. So, for me, I don't see why that's... Are they beliefs, and if they're... why is he not an expert, if they are?
Well, are they beliefs? I would say yes, why not? Because, I mean, if once he thinks that he's acquiring this information from a reliable source, he just kind of gets I mean, supposing that he's not in a very kind of a highly skeptical scenario, he gets these right answers to questions, whatever these questions are, he can get true beliefs about physiology simply by reading, by learning.
Are they not true beliefs about the exam? He knows that this question has this answer, but does he really believe that in physiology this is related to this? If you're saying he's just remembering by heart the answers to the questions, I'm not sure that he has beliefs about physiology.
Well, I mean, he gets out of the room and he starts talking to he meets with his brother after the exam and he says, wow, I didn't know that, I don't know, the heart and it works this way. And he thinks he gets knowledge from reading the answer. I don't see like...
So why is he an expert? He knows all this stuff.
Well, because, I mean, if you want to say that he is an expert, I mean, that I think I mean, the problem here is that he has... how can I say that? So he has no idea of how these bits of information connect to each other, right? So he just knows this thing about the heart, this thing about the mind, the brain, this thing about the tool, this thing about... I mean, I wouldn't be willing to call him an expert, but I mean, well, I might have to look for like a more, how can I say, more effective example.
So there's a follow-up here from Harry.
Yeah, I was to say, if you want to pursue this argument, the place you should go is Searle's Chinese Room debate about artificial intelligence.
Okay.
It's about whether the machine who knows everything about how to speak Chinese doesn't understand Chinese.
So, Jean?
Okay.
I'm wondering if your imagination is being captured too much by the scientist case, because scientists are researchers. But there's a lot of mundane kinds of experts, like lawyers and engineers, who don't really contribute to a new body of knowledge. However, they function very well as experts because what they do is they apply knowledge. Like they take what is known as best practices of how to build a bridge, and they help you build a bridge here in this particular case. But that never gets published. I mean, it's not exchanged with others. But they seem to be experts. I'm wondering if the word research is going to mislead, is going to lead you in the wrong way. And you need to develop, maybe borrow from Harry, but another kind of vocabulary for saying what this, they're creative, they're using their knowledge, they're enriching the world with their knowledge, but they're not teaching. But they're not really doing what we would call research.
Yes, fair enough. What I have to say about it. I mean, I was trying to play the game with on Goldman's rules, and I was trying to say that, for instance, I think I wouldn't call the doctor an expert in medicine simply because he got a degree in medicine, right? I mean, that's something I mean, if that's the game we want to play with Goldman's rules, the function being either research-oriented, I mean, yeah, if you want that I change the label, I'm fine with changing it, but I'm not creating up this function by myself. This is kind of something you can derive from the ability, which is a necessary condition on Goldman's view.
So if my doctor, tests me and cures me, and that's all that he ever does, he never publishes about that.
Yes.
He's not an expert.
I mean, he is an expert on the novice-oriented account. If you're happy with that, I don't have a problem.
No, I like your alternative account, but it just seems to exclude a whole bunch of people that we call experts because epistemic progress I mean, it's basically an account of how to be a university
Well,
professor.
let me refine a little bit this. Let me refine a little bit this thing. So, one maybe little way to go out here is that Goldman. I stick to Goldman's project. Goldman says that these people need to have the ability to do that. It doesn't matter whether they do that. They might not have time. They might not be allowed to do that. But they need to have the ability to give a contribution. According to other people, this doesn't make any sense because once they have this body of information, like more, whatever, they got a degree, they have definitely more understanding and more knowledge than we have on the field. Therefore, they fulfill the novice and the function, they're experts. But if you want to say that they need to have the ability, then yes, if they lack the ability, they are not expert, and it seems like they are not expert because the distinctive feature of expertise in this case is having this capacity to give a contribution, which might not prevent one who does have the capacity without being able in practical life to do that, to be an expert.
So Maria has a follow-up?
Just along the same lines, I think this account doesn't take into account the practical side of expertise.
Sure, yeah.
The problem solving and building things, etc.
Fine, yeah, I agree.
So in the middle there? Yes.
Yeah, actually, mine was rather on the same point as well. And the only thing I wanted to add to what Jean said is surely a lot of the time these mundane experts are generating new knowledge. They're generating the knowledge that this particular patient in front of them has got this particular disease. And it's not a new breakthrough in the discipline, but it's still a new piece of knowledge.
Yes, but they will still be kind of fulfilling the novice-oriented function rather than the research-oriented one.
But if the research-oriented function is the ability to generate new knowledge in answer to questions in D, if the question in D is, Doctor, what is wrong with me? And the answer is,
that's a problem with the shortening the definition. The idea, the condition says that in answer to questions arising within the domain between the people who are working in the domain, that's kind of a, yes, I shortened that a little too much probably, yeah.
So at the end?
Yeah, so just a quick example, I'm just curious what you think of it. And the point of the example is to challenge the idea that an expert, part of being an expert is a kind of comparative requirement, i.e. that you're doing better epistemically than most people, right?
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a extreme case, but anyway. So suppose there's a nuclear war, and after nuclear war, there are only 5 people left, and 3 of them are brain surgeons. Do we want to say that those 3 people are no longer experts, or what do we want to say in that kind of case?
They are no longer experts because...
Well, if you have this comparative requirement that says that basically that the expert is someone who has to be doing better epistemically than most people, then this kind of example is at least suggesting that maybe that's problematic.
Yeah, no, but I guess I thought I dealt with this question here when I said on Goldman's account you need to fulfill the objective threshold. You need to be above objective threshold. So 3 of them are, oh, I see what you mean.
Right.
Like the majority of people in this case, sorry about that, yeah. The majority of people in this case is, yes, okay, so I guess Goldman, if I go along with Goldman way, I would say they are expert anyway because they reach the threshold. They fulfill the non-comparative clause. The non-comparative clause being the idea that they are above the number, whatever it is, of true beliefs or the degree of understanding that makes one an expert in some field.
So you don't need any comparison. You don't need to talk about doing better.
No, I mean, on Goldman's view, in the end, you need to be above the threshold. So it's much less comparative than it appears to be.
Okay.
Yes, I agree with the point. I shortened the paper down. Cody has a totally comparative view, and he says you have to be better than number of people that you have around, and there are problems depending on which kind of class you pick. And I try to do that in the paper, but I didn't do that now. But thanks, it's a good example.
So only if it's a very short question, Ed.
It's just super clarification. I just lost a bit of what rules the game were. So I think that came up a bit earlier. It's just, so what's our project? Are we just trying to define how we ordinarily think of
No.
experts, or is there some explanatory role that experts is playing such that we can assess whether?
So here is the thing. So Goldman, in different situations, endorses to different accounts of the expert, but he requires any account of the expert to fulfill a definition requirement and a function requirement, right?
So I guess, is the definition we're giving one of what we ordinarily think an expert is?
No, what it has to be a normative project.
So what's that mean?
A normative project?
I'm just wondering how we assess your claim about what an expert is. What do we measure it against? What are we trying to characterize?
The notion of cognitive of intellectual expertise in a field. Okay, so the idea is these guys in the like Goldman and other social epistemologists are working with this conceptual analysis. I don't understand if you're trying to challenge the idea that conceptual analysis can do the job, and I can agree with you, it can do the job, but my job here is to show what we can do better with the conceptual analysis tool. I'm not taking a stand into what other kind of tools can, I'm pretty happy to receive any suggestion for other tools that might allow us to do a better job. I just want to say, hey Goldman, if this is the project with this kind of function thing, and if there are people on one side of the novice-oriented and the people on the research-oriented, this is why I think it's better to go for the research-oriented. I didn't want to teach you any kind of broad lesson on what you have to think about expertise in philosophy. Yeah.
So let's thank Michele for his talk.
Cheers.
So there's a coffee break once again in the business school. Tomorrow's coffee breaks will be in this building. The lawyers will be gone. I wouldn't have the building. But if you can move to...
Are you sure they'll be gone?
A majority of